But first, the Prime Minister was quite right when he said the other day that superannuation contributions are our money, not something that belongs to union-run super funds until they reluctantly let us have our money when we retire sometime in our 60s. With small businesses decimated by the lockdowns put in place to manage this pandemic, and more than 40% of Australian workers on some sort of government wage welfare, which can't and won't last forever, the Morrison government's decision to let people access up to $20,000 of their own money from their own super funds seems just the sort of extraordinary response we might want from governments in these extraordinary times. After all, since compulsory super began some 30 years ago, other than being diagnosed with a terminal illness or some other exceptional life event, most people only see their super when they retire. But we can't say this pandemic is extraordinary. We can't see individuals and families under extreme financial stress and not let them access a modern amount of their own money, can we? Naturally, as you'd expect, the big union-controlled super funds are unhappy. Labor figures from Kevin Rudd and Paul Keating to Greg Combay complaining that people's retirement incomes are under threat.
Pigs might fly. That is the biggest bullshit argument I have ever heard against going ahead with decent provision for people's superannuation savings for the future. This is a cruel assault by Morrison on the retirement income of working Australians and using the cover of COVID to try and get away with it.
Now, hang on. That's always been one of the problems with compulsory super from the get-go. It reduces our wages now by a massive 9.5%, which is planned to increase now, of course, without actually giving most people enough income to avoid the pension in retirement. Would it surprise you to know, as I said, 30 years ago, after Labor introduced compulsory super, that still today around 65% of people over the age of 65 still receive the aged pension, full or part. They're still getting taxpayer support. So 3 decades on, almost 70% of Australians need taxpayer-funded support in their retirement. Now, as things stand, over the next 30 years, we'll see a modest increase in part pensioners. But the percentage of retirees that are fully self-funded, well, that'll hardly change. It'll stay around 30-odd%. Now, that tells you, doesn't it, that the system is not what it's cracked up to be. The big beneficiary, of course, of compulsory super is not you or me, even though it's our money taken from our pay packets, but the people who manage our funds, those who cream off around $32 billion every year in management fees. In fact, far from being the big win for working people that Bob Hawke and Paul Keating once claimed compulsory super was, it's one of the all-time great wealth transfers from relatively modest income workers to relatively rich fund managers. And along the way, of course, a big boost to trade unions that win from industry fund director fees. But more than that, union industry funds use the weight of their shareholding in big companies to neuter business, to push corporates who should be ready supporters of capitalism to push them further the way of the woke. It's why mining companies are being forced out of mining, particularly coal, or why banks are demanding culture change that's got nothing to do with running a good bank. Once it was only a handful of Liberal backbenchers who opposed the legislated lift to 12% in compulsory super. But now that about 3 million people have voted with their feet and accessed their super to keep them going through the pandemic, the PM himself now says that he's no longer wedded to the increase. At the very least, further increases should be deferred. Right now, with unemployment headed to 13% and a recession that will become official on Wednesday, isn't it time that we trusted Australians with a little more of their own money? Well, that would be a nice change.